10-year-old black boy stops to help a stranger fix a broken-down car and unknowingly unravels a billion-dollar secret that exploited gifted children like him. What began as a small act of kindness on a quiet road explodes into a national reckoning, corporate collapse, and a movement that redefines what genius really looks like. This isn't just a story about talent. It's about truth, justice, and how one boy changed everything without ever meaning to. The late summer heat rolled off the cracked pavement like waves, bending the air above the desolate roadside. Elijah Brooks, a quiet 10-year-old boy with dark skin and cautious eyes, trudged home from his school's half-day science program. His backpack, patched and dusty, bounced lightly against his back with every step. A mile ahead, the gleam of a stranded luxury vehicle pierced the rural stillness. A silver electric Bentley. Hood popped open like a question mark. Elijah slowed. The man beside the car, a sharply dressed white executive in his 40s, was pacing in expensive shoes ill-suited for gravel. He shouted into a Bluetooth earpiece, frustration rolling off him in waves. He kept repeating the same thing, that he had a meeting with the state energy commissioner in 2 hours, that the tow truck was late, that the car was brand new and should have been flawless. Elijah's first instinct was to walk on. His aunt always warned him about talking to strangers, especially out here on the edges of Pine Valley, an economically struggling black community about 90 minutes outside of Atlanta. But something about the man's frantic gestures gave Elijah pause. He hesitated, then stepped off the shoulder and walked closer. "Sir," Elijah said cautiously, "you need help?" The man looked up, startled. His eyes flicked from Elijah's worn sneakers to the faded STEM Academy t-shirt he wore 2 sizes too big. His face settled into a polite smile edged with dismissal. "That's kind of you, but this is a high-efficiency vehicle. I need someone trained in EV systems." Elijah stepped closer anyway and squinted under the hood. "My uncle's an EV tech. Taught me how to run diagnostics with just a voltmeter in your ears." He pulled a small multi-tool from his bag and reached for a pair of insulated gloves. "Just let me listen for a second." The man opened his mouth to protest again, but Elijah had already crouched down and placed his ear near the motor housing. Seconds passed. Then he stood and pointed calmly to the left cooling duct. "You've got a bypass valve jammed. That's what's causing the thermal lockout. You'll keep shorting your backup battery if you don't fix the airflow." The man blinked. "How do you know that?" "It hums weird when it's overheating," Elijah replied, already reaching into his backpack for a piece of thermal tape. "I can patch it for now, but you'll need a full diagnostic when you get to town." The man watched in disbelief as Elijah's small hands worked with mechanical confidence. What the boy didn't say was that he'd fixed things like this before. Computers, vending machines, the outdated school printer his teachers kept smacking. Elijah didn't just tinker, he understood. When he finally introduced himself as Elijah Brooks, the man froze. His expression shifted. His name was Carson Vale, founder of Vale Grid Technologies. And something about that name, Elijah Brooks, stirred an old memory Carson had spent years burying. Carson Vale couldn't sleep. The image of that little girl, Selah Daniels, flickered through his mind like static on an old screen. Not just her hands, swift and practiced as they patched his overheating electric car. Not just her voice, calm and confident despite his condescending tone. It was the name, Daniels. And the way the ring on her hand glinted in the sun. Emerald green, carved edges, identical to one he'd seen 12 years ago, under very different circumstances. Back then, Carson was a rising star at Helix Corps, a defense tech firm infamous for its secret research into cognitive talent acquisition. He'd since distanced himself from the company, building ValeGrid on clean energy and smart infrastructure. But the ghosts hadn't left, and Selah's face brought them roaring back. Sitting in his penthouse apartment that overlooked downtown Charlotte, Carson pulled up old Helix Core files from an encrypted hard drive he hadn't touched in a decade. The directories were filled with personnel logs, asset acquisition documents, and unsettling project names like Orion Pool and Theta Youth. He typed in one phrase: Emerald Project. Up came a single child profile, no photo, marked removed from registry after an internal whistleblower incident. The document included a name once crossed out in red ink: Selah Whitman, age 3 at the time. Special notes: high pattern recognition, spatial intuition, unverified parental ties to military research staff. But that wasn't what made Carson's breath catch. Under the section labeled Possessions Upon Transfer, there it was: heirloom emerald ring with crescent flaw, classified symbolic artifact. Selah Daniels, Selah Whitman. Could they be the same person? He closed the file and dialed his assistant. Find me everything on Selah Daniels. 10 years old. Lives in South Shelby, near the old Harper Station power substation. Meanwhile, just outside that substation, Selah sat in a dim workshop behind her aunt's home. The walls were lined with neatly arranged tools and salvaged electronics, each piece catalogued in her own handwriting. She was elbow-deep in the circuit board of a 1990s FM receiver when her aunt, Lorna, peeked in. "You forgot dinner again." Selah looked up, blinking behind safety goggles. "Sorry, I was fixing the feedback loop. It was humming weird." Lorna smiled, but her eyes lingered on the emerald ring wrapped tight around her niece's finger with frayed red thread. "That man you met today, what was his name?" Carson Vale." "He gave me his card," Selah replied, reaching into her bag. "I said if I ever needed anything, I could call." Lorna stared at the card like it was radioactive. She turned and walked out without a word. That night, Lorna and her husband Darnell sat across from each other in the quiet kitchen. Neither ate. Between them sat a box they hadn't opened in almost a decade. Inside, an old ID badge with the name Doctor. Lydia Whitman, a folded newspaper article about a controversial research program shut down mid-investigation, and a grainy photo of Lydia with a baby in her arms. "Do you think she remembers?" Lorna asked. "She was 3 when Lydia ran," Darnell said. "But if Carson Vale shows up again, she's going to find out everything whether we're ready or not." In his office the next morning, Carson received the background check on Selah. Officially, she didn't exist before age 4. No birth certificate. No early medical records. Nothing before the emergency guardianship granted to Lorna Daniels. His search hit a wall, but he wasn't the only one looking. Journalist Taryn Bishop from a public accountability nonprofit had spent years chasing leads on Helix Core's defunct child development program. When Carson's name popped up in connection to Selah, her instincts screamed cover-up. Back in Shelby, Selah returned from school to find her uncle pacing in the driveway. "You ever think about your mom?" he asked out of nowhere. "All the time," she said. "I know she was a scientist. Aunt Lorna won't say much, but I remember her face. I remember she smelled like peppermint oil and printer ink." Darnell knelt down. "If she left you something to help you remember who you are, would you want to see it?" Selah didn't answer. She didn't need to. That night, she opened the same box her aunt and uncle had kept buried for years. Inside, she found a sealed envelope labeled Selah, for when you're ready. As she unfolded the note, her fingers trembled. Her birth name, her mother's handwriting. A sentence that made her stop breathing. "You were taken from a place that tried to turn brilliance into a weapon. I kept the ring because it's the only key left to the truth. Sela Daniels sat on the floor of her bedroom, the letter from her mother spread across her lap. The words were plain, but their weight pressed down hard. A government-sponsored child research program, a mysterious project that vanished after a scandal, a mother who fled with her daughter under cover of night, and a ring, not just jewelry, but a key, a symbol, a warning. That same night, several miles away in a glass tower rising above Charlotte's financial district, Carson Vale stood before a wall of digital projections. His private tech team had overlaid maps, ownership records, and building permits. At the center of it all, Harper Station, the decommissioned energy site where Sela now lived. What used to be a substation was once also a hidden testing facility, purchased under a shell corporation linked to his old employer, Helix Core. Carson tapped his phone. "Send a security detail, quiet surveillance only. I want eyes on the girl, her caretakers, and anyone else poking around. She has something, and she may not even know it." He hesitated before ending the call. Part of him felt like he was slipping back into a world he thought he'd left behind. But too many questions were colliding now, too many pieces clicking into place. Meanwhile, in South Shelby, Sela was already under someone else's watch. Not just Carson's team, but a separate, unnamed entity. A matte black SUV had been seen idling near the school's exit. Two men, unmarked suits, tinted windows. That afternoon, one of them snapped a photo of Sela as she walked home with her classmates. She didn't notice, but her uncle Darnell did. He followed at a distance in his pickup, every instinct on edge. When he reached the house, he parked behind the workshop and went inside without a word. "Lorna," he called, "we need to talk." Sela listened from the hallway as her aunt and uncle whispered urgently in the kitchen. She could only hear pieces. "That SUV's not local. Government plates. It's starting again." Across town, investigative journalist Taryn Bishop reviewed footage from a public records hearing 3 years earlier. A blurred voice mentioned orphan code designations and neuroadaptive profiling. The terminology was familiar, vaguely, because it mirrored phrases she'd heard while researching human capital exploitation in biotech firms. When she dug further, she found a defunct LLC once tied to Helix Core, and recently reactivated under a different name. It was now the official contractor for Project Luminol, a statewide youth enrichment program claiming to offer scholarships for underprivileged STEM students. It sounded noble, but one of the pilot locations? Harper Station, Sela's neighborhood. That night, Sela opened the back panel of the emerald ring for the first time. It wasn't just a hollow stone, it was a compartment. Inside, folded tight as a postage stamp, was a micro-storage chip. Her mother had hidden it. She stared at it, breath caught, then tucked it into a small electronics case and zipped it into the lining of her backpack. The next day, Vale Grid Security reported unusual drone interference near Harper Station. Someone else was scanning the perimeter. Carson was beginning to panic. Not because of Sela, but because he realized he wasn't the only one trying to recover the truth. The longer this stretched on, the more public it could become. And if that happened, not only would his company be implicated, but so would several of his former associates in government-backed R&D. Meanwhile, Sela started noticing subtle changes around her. A teacher she'd never seen before showed up to substitute math. A counselor she'd never talked to suddenly asked about her career plans. "You ever consider an advanced mentorship program?" they asked. "We're selecting students for something special." Sela smiled politely, but inside she was calculating. By the end of the week, Darnell had quietly reactivated a secure line, something Lydia had given him years ago for emergencies only. He made the call. A man picked up. Calm, deliberate voice. Who is this? It's about the girl, Darnell said, and the chip in her ring. Silence. Then a reply. Where are you? Darnell gave no address. Only coordinates. The city skyline gleamed under the pale morning light as Sela Daniels stepped out of the car and into the heart of downtown Raleigh. Her hands were clenched around her backpack straps. Inside, wrapped in 2 layers of cloth, was the emerald ring, and the chip her mother had hidden within it. Her uncle had arranged the meeting in secret, a secure building. Anonymous offices, unmarked doors. At the top floor, a tall woman in a blazer met them without introduction. She nodded once and gestured toward the conference room. Inside sat 3 people, a federal prosecutor named Imani Reese, the investigative journalist Taryn Bishop, and the man who had once built an empire on silence, Carson Vale. Sela stepped forward. The air felt thin. She reached into her bag and carefully pulled out the ring. This belonged to my mother, she said. She was Dr. Lydia Whitman. She hid this when she ran. Reese leaned forward, her eyes serious. You're saying there's evidence inside? Sela nodded. A chip. It has files, blueprints, video, names. When she handed it over, Taryn carefully placed the chip into a secure reader. On the screen, a folder opened. The room went silent. The first file was labeled Orchid. The second, Y-17 subjects. The third, Neurofield applications, child trials. The screen flickered to life with a video. In it, a younger Carson Vale stood at a terminal, reading from a log. Subject, Sela W., age 3, high neuroplasticity, exceptional mechanical abstraction. Mother, Lydia W., recently terminated from observational team after breach of protocol. Carson turned away, shame reddening his face. Reese paused the video. Was this part of the Helix Core project? He exhaled slowly. Yes, but I wasn't the one running it. I was recruited as a systems analyst. By the time I understood what we were doing, it was too late. Your mother, Lydia, she stole this chip and ran. That night, 3 staff members disappeared. The program was shut down, or so we thought. Taryn scrolled to a folder marked Restricted Archives. Inside, dozens of child profiles filled the screen. Sela's among them. Each profile listed a talent. Not a disability, not a test score, a gift. One child could reconstruct blueprints after a single glance. Another could solve unstructured logic patterns in seconds, all from underserved communities. Many were Black, Hispanic, or Indigenous, all labeled as assets. Sela's hands trembled. They never wanted to help us, she said softly. They wanted to use us. Taryn looked up. And now they're doing it again. That youth mentorship program, Project Luminal, it's the same thing, just rebranded. They're targeting kids like you again. Only now, it's being funded through state partnerships. Reese stepped forward. Sela, what you've brought us, it's more than just a story. This is evidence of a systematic violation of ethics, privacy, and child protection law. You've exposed something deep. Carson stood. If I help, if I testify, can we dismantle the whole program? Reese met his eyes. If you give us everything, we'll subpoena records, secure warrants, and notify the Department of Justice. That afternoon, news quietly broke on local channels. A federal inquiry had opened into Project Luminal. Carson's company issued a vague press release about cooperating with investigations. But behind closed doors, the fallout was swift. 2 board members resigned. Corporate attorneys scrambled to shift liability. And in the midst of it all, Sela went home to South Shelby, where her Aunt Lorna waited with tearful eyes and warm arms. You did it, she whispered. But Sela didn't smile, not yet. That night, someone threw a rock through their workshop window. The message was clear. Across the country, footage from the chip began surfacing through Taryn's platform, leaked anonymously. Clips of internal Helix Core briefings, memos referencing talent monetization, interviews with former analysts now working for defense contractors. The public outcry built slowly, first online, then in policy forums, then on primetime news. The narrative struck a chord. A gifted black girl uncovering a hidden network of corporate and government exploitation. The emerald ring became a symbol, shared across social media, printed on protest signs, replicated in digital filters. But it wasn't just symbolic. At a press conference 2 weeks later, Salah stood beside Prosecutor Reese, Carson Vale, and Taryn Bishop. Journalists filled the room. She spoke with a calm beyond her years. "My name is Selah Daniels. I'm 10 years old. My mother gave her life to protect me. I'm here today because she believed that every child deserves freedom, not surveillance, not experimentation, not exploitation, just the chance to grow without fear." The room stood in stunned silence. Reese stepped forward, holding up the ring. This was the device that opened everything, a child's inheritance and a key to systemic truth. Within days, bipartisan calls for congressional hearings emerged. Civil rights groups launched campaigns demanding reparations for impacted families. Helix Core's legacy investments were frozen. State departments quietly paused Project Luminal pending review. But while the headlines focused on the scandal, Selah focused on something else: repair. In her small workshop, the broken window now boarded up, she organized every file from the chip into a catalog of children. Names, locations, abilities. Some were still missing. Others had gone into foster care. A few, like her, had been adopted and never told who they really were. With Darnell and Lorna's help, Selah began writing letters. Not to lawyers, to the other kids. "You don't know me, but we were part of something we didn't choose. You're not alone. I've seen what you can do, and I believe in it." The letters would eventually turn into invitations to a gathering, a reunion of sorts, not just to share stories, but to build something new. Meanwhile, Carson sat in a closed-door deposition, handing over hard drives and old contracts. Everything he once built to hide what happened, he was now using to dismantle it. He had lost everything: his shares, his name, his empire. But in its place, he'd found something he never expected: a purpose. Outside the courthouse, a mural had been painted on the sidewalk wall. A young girl in overalls holding a glowing ring in one hand and a circuit board in the other. Below it, the words, "No child should be owned. No mind should be weaponized. No gift should be hidden." Selah walked past that mural every day on her way to school, and every time she looked up at it, not with pride, but with responsibility, because uncovering the truth was just the first step. Now came the real work. 5 years passed. In the city of Durham, where brick warehouses once stored cotton and tobacco, a new complex rose in their place. A blend of glass, solar panels, and recycled steel. Lush gardens stretched across rooftops, and 3D-printed sculptures lined the courtyard. In brushed metal above the entrance were 5 simple words: "The Elias Center for Applied Futures." Inside, students from across the country moved between robotics labs, biotech pods, and audio engineering studios. Most were under 18. Many were from places long forgotten by education reform: reservations, housing projects, border towns, rural districts without consistent Wi-Fi. All had one thing in common: an ability that someone once called too much for a traditional system. Elijah Brooks, now 15, stood in the middle of the East Atrium surrounded by visitors from tech startups and university partnerships. He wore jeans, a navy hoodie, and the same ring his mother once gave him. No longer wrapped in thread, but fit perfectly to his hand. His voice was calm but certain. "We built this place not just to nurture talent, but to protect it," he said. "For kids who fix things, build things, see the world in patterns. Kids like I used to be, who weren't believed." Across the atrium, Carson Vale stood with his hands behind his back. His graying beard and simple attire made him nearly unrecognizable from the billionaire technocrat he once was. He had donated everything, his holdings, patents, and company shares, to create what now stood before him. "Let them call me a traitor to industry," he had said once. "I'd rather be remembered for what I helped build than what I allowed to happen." The Elias Center, named in honor of Elijah's mother and the lives lost during the Helix core collapse, was different by design. No selective entrance exams, no NDAs, no hidden clauses. Each student received full support: housing, meals, therapy, and mentorship. The center's funding came from a public-private partnership where transparency was non-negotiable, monitored quarterly by an independent ethics review council. It wasn't just about giving access. It was about rewriting what access meant. In one of the center's smaller workshops, Elijah hunched over a housing prototype. Next to him sat Amira, a blind teen from rural Alabama who could map entire environments using echolocation sensors she developed from old game controllers. On the opposite bench was Raphael, a neurodivergent coder who spoke rarely but could design quantum logic gates in his sleep. Together, they were refining modular shelter units for families displaced by flood zones in North Carolina's lowlands, climate-vulnerable communities that rarely saw investment. "We're not just prototyping structures," Amira said during a live-streamed demo. "We're prototyping equity." The center's live streams, now viewed by millions monthly, offered more than just inspiration. They challenged systems. Each project was tied to community impact, redesigning water filtration systems for neglected townships, repurposing abandoned infrastructure, creating open-source accessibility tech. Every month, Elijah recorded a segment called Circuit Notes, where he explained their designs in simple language to kids watching from anywhere. One clip, where he repaired a public school's elevator using a modified Raspberry Pi, had over 8 million views. But for Elijah, it wasn't about going viral. It was about creating visibility for the kind of genius that existed everywhere, but was too often ignored. Back in South Shelby, the once-abandoned Harper Station site had been transformed into a regional STEM prep hub. The black SUV surveillance had long since disappeared, replaced by solar-powered buses bringing students from across the county. Darnell, Elijah's uncle, now led the mechanical training program there, using a curriculum he developed with Elijah himself. Even Lorna, who had once sworn never to step back into institutional systems, now ran community outreach for the center's rural partnerships. "Not everyone's a prodigy," she often reminded donors, "but every kid has a spark. We're here to build spaces where sparks don't burn out." Yet rebuilding wasn't easy. The federal lawsuits against Helix Core and its surviving affiliates had dragged on for years. Class action settlements were still being processed. Some former staff had fled overseas. Others claimed ignorance. But through the Department of Justice, 64 families had been identified and compensated for the exploitation of their children's abilities. And the consequences rippled wider. Congress passed the Youth Ethics and Talent Act, requiring independent oversight of all youth-targeted research and mentorship programs receiving federal funds. Universities scrambled to update ethics codes. Major firms quietly ended recruitment programs that had once mined exceptional children for pre-college pipelines. But no legislation could erase what happened. That's why Elijah insisted on a space inside the Elias Center no one could avoid. At the heart of the atrium stood a curved digital wall called the Registry of the Unacknowledged. Every name ever linked to the original Helix Core program, subject, caregiver, whistleblower, was etched into its memory bank. Some entries were anonymized for safety. Others glowed bright with photographs, quotes, blueprints left behind. Visitors could interact with the wall through voice commands, asking to see stories. One by one, they lit up. I could rebuild anything, but I couldn't rebuild trust. J. Torres, subject 09. They said my art wasn't profitable. Now it hangs in courthouses. KM, subject 18. I never got to say goodbye to my sister. This is her page. L. Monroe, sibling. It wasn't a museum. It was a reckoning. Elijah visited the wall every Friday before classes started. Not as a ritual, but as a reminder. One morning, as a new group of students entered for orientation, he stood beside the wall, watching them read. He turned to Amira and said, "They're going to change everything." She smiled. "We already did." Outside, on the east side of the building, a new mural was being painted, this one showing not just a ring, but a circuit flowing from a child's hand into the skyline beyond. The words beneath it read, "Systems break. Children shouldn't. So we rebuild." It was a clear morning in Washington, D.C., and the National Museum of Future Innovation buzzed with quiet anticipation. A new permanent exhibit was set to open. Unveiled, The Code Within, dedicated to the children exploited by private and government-led talent acquisition programs over the past 2 decades. Among the invited guests was 15-year-old Elijah Brooks. He walked past holographic renderings of advanced circuitry, biometric patents, and voice-guided archives detailing how children, especially from underserved and marginalized communities, had once been turned into unknowing assets. Their brilliance studied, monetized, archived in silence. At the end of the gallery, a single glass case displayed an object that had sparked it all: the emerald ring. Now, reset on a polished wooden base, it shimmered under soft lights. Its inscription, once worn by friction, had been carefully restored. Carved beneath it on the platform were the words, "What they tried to bury became the seed." Elijah stood before it quietly. His reflection merged with the artifact in the glass. Behind him, museum visitors moved through the exhibit, reading, absorbing, questioning. But Elijah wasn't there for ceremony. He was waiting for someone. A voice broke his focus. "Elijah," the woman said, approaching slowly, "I didn't think I'd get the chance to meet you in person." She wore a dark coat, her hair cropped close, and a federal badge tucked discreetly on her hip. Her name was Naomi Whitaker, Howard Whitaker's daughter. Once, her family name had been synonymous with power and secrecy. But years ago, she had stepped away from the family empire, joining the Office of Civil Investigations. When the Elias Center released its independent report detailing systemic violations by Helix Corp and its corporate partners, Naomi had been one of the first inside the Department of Justice to push for national transparency legislation. "I brought something," she said, handing him a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter, handwritten, not by Naomi, but by someone Elijah never expected to hear from again: Carson Vale. It had been 2 years since Carson quietly disappeared from public life. After testifying before the Senate Subcommittee on Child Exploitation and Corporate Ethics, he'd turned down every interview and award. Rumors spread that he was living off-grid in the Carolinas. Elijah opened the letter slowly. "If you're reading this, I'm where I belong. Quiet, finally. But I needed to say this. The truth cost me everything. But it also gave me something real, the chance to watch you lead. You didn't just expose a system, you reimagined one. What I couldn't do with power, you did with purpose. It ended with a simple request. Take care of what comes next. Elijah folded the letter and placed it inside his jacket. Later that week, he returned to Durham to find a letter waiting at the Elias Center. No return address, just a name written in careful block letters. Jeremiah. He recognized the name. One of the kids from the registry. File 22C, labeled nonverbal, gifted in algorithmic logic. Inside the envelope was a small, hand-built prototype, an analog security chip etched with a unique heat signature, and a note. I figured out how to make my ideas speak. Thank you for giving me the place to try. That one line stayed with Elijah, not because it was flattering, but because it reminded him of what was still broken. Not every child had a voice, not every story had a spotlight, and not every ring carried a secret. Some just carried scars. 2 months later, Elijah stood in front of the state legislature in North Carolina, alongside mentors and students from the Elias Center. They presented a proposal, the Open Futures Bill, a statewide initiative that would fund publicly governed makerspaces and STEM incubators across under-resourced districts. Not labs for the gifted, spaces for everyone. Because brilliance isn't rare, Elijah said, access is. His testimony was streamed live, trending within hours. Clips from the speech-flooded platforms, shared under hashtags like number from secrets to systems and number every child counts. More than just an algorithm-pleasing moment, the video struck something deeper. It wasn't just about Elijah anymore, it was about kids like Jeremiah, Amira, Raphael, and those no one had found yet. Later that spring, the Open Futures Bill passed with bipartisan support. For the first time, systemic change wasn't just reactive, it was proactive. Across cities and towns, students who had once watched Elijah's circuit notes began building their own projects. Teachers who had never received STEM funding now had access to training, supplies, and mentorship networks. Youth from refugee camps, juvenile justice programs, and rural areas submitted blueprints to the center. Some asked for feedback. Others just wanted to say thank you. One young girl from Mississippi wrote, "I thought I was weird because I could hear frequencies, but then I saw your video about electromagnetic mapping. Now, I think maybe I'm just early." Elijah printed the letter and posted it on the wall outside his lab. Not for him, for the next kid who walked in, unsure of whether they belonged. He still wore the emerald ring. Not because it made him special, but because it reminded him of what happens when power sees potential as property instead of possibility. At the end of that school year, the Elias Center held its third annual Student Makers Showcase. One student presented a solar-powered farm irrigation system for flood zones. Another rebuilt an analog braille reader from salvaged e-waste. A team from Oklahoma reverse-engineered a drone delivery system to supply tribal lands with medical kits. And Elijah, he didn't present anything, he just watched, because his new mission wasn't to be the face of a movement. It was to make sure there didn't need to be one. That night, as the sun dipped behind the center's curved glass canopy, Elijah stood at the mural on the eastern wall. The ring, the circuit, the skyline. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a fresh chip, a new one. Blank. And he smiled. Let's see what we can build next. Years later, long after the headlines faded and the court cases settled, people still told the story. Not of a scandal, not even of a conspiracy, but of a boy with grease-stained fingers who offered help on the side of a road, and, unknowingly, unlocked the hidden machinery of a system that had commodified children's gifts for profit. The story of Elijah Brooks had become a case study in classrooms, a social justice module in teacher training, and a discussion point in ethics panels from Seattle to Atlanta. But more than anything, it had become a mirror, forcing people to ask what kind of world allowed potential to be filtered, ranked, and silenced. At the heart of the legacy wasn't just the Elias Center or the Ring, or even the Registry of Exploited Children. It was the moral shift, the redefinition of brilliance, the dismantling of exceptionalism. Because Elijah was never just a prodigy. He was a reminder that talent, real talent, lives everywhere. That systems built to reward only the extraordinary often overlook what is deeply human, the desire to understand, to build, to be seen. What started with a coolant leak and a ring became a national reckoning about equity, data ethics, and the cost of unregulated innovation. Elijah's journey showed that justice is more than accountability. It's about restoration. And that restoration didn't happen in courtrooms. It happened in workshops. It happened when students like Layla from Newark learned to 3D print adaptive instruments so her brother could play music again. It happened when Devante from a Navajo Nation high school submitted a blueprint for sustainable battery cells made from clay minerals in local soil. It happened when thousands of young people, many of whom had been labeled behind or broken, walked into new spaces and weren't asked to prove themselves first. The ring that once symbolized secrecy now symbolized transparency. The chip that once hid data now protected it. The name Brooks, once unknown outside a rural county, became shorthand for a different kind of leadership, one rooted in humility, ethics, and quiet persistence. For Elijah, legacy wasn't something built on milestones. It was built on moments. Moments like when a teacher in Baton Rouge told him, "My students used to be afraid of STEM. Now they call it storytelling with circuits." Or when a 9-year-old girl from Compton mailed him a hand-drawn comic book with robots and solar panels, and a little boy in a hoodie fixing the world one wire at a time. "His name's Eli," she wrote. "He's kind of like you, but he's also kind of like me." And that's what mattered most. Not that Elijah had been special, but that others finally realized they could be too. His mother had once told him that broken machines could be fixed, but broken systems had to be redesigned. He now knew she wasn't just talking about circuits. She was talking about how society decides who gets to be included, how it defines value, how it allocates opportunity. The biggest myth Elijah had worked to dismantle was the idea that kids like him were rare. They weren't. They were just rarely believed. That was the deeper injustice. It wasn't just what Helix Corps had done. It was what schools failed to notice, what policies failed to protect, what neighborhoods never got funded, what dreams were delayed because someone didn't test well or speak on cue or look the part. Elijah's legacy was a refusal to let the story end with exposure. He pushed for reinvention, for open-access learning tools in multiple languages, for universal design in curriculum, for investment in local mentorship, for mental health support tailored to kids carrying generational burdens of underestimation, and perhaps most importantly, for systems that did not wait until a child performed magic to decide they were worth saving. By his 18th birthday, Elijah had already turned down multiple honorary degrees. When asked why, he said, "Degrees are earned." "I'm still learning." His humility made some uncomfortable, but that was the point. He wasn't interested in being the exception. He was interested in changing the expectation. The day before he left to study mechanical ethics at a public university in New Mexico, Elijah stood alone in the center's southern courtyard. He looked out at a group of students installing kinetic tiles that would store and convert their footsteps into clean energy. They were laughing, collaborating, free. That's what the future should look like. not powered by secrets, but by movement, by people stepping into spaces that once shut them out, bringing light as they go. The mural on the wall beside him had faded a bit. The ring, the circuit, the skyline, it was all still there. But someone had added something new beneath the original words. We're not here to be the next prodigies. We're here to make sure we're not the last. Elijah smiled, then turned toward the open gate and walked forward. It began with something small. A 10-year-old boy walking home along a sun-scorched road, a broken-down car, a stranger in a suit. A question asked with quiet confidence. You need help? No camera crew, no staged spotlight, just a child holding a toolkit and a willingness to act. That moment didn't look like the beginning of anything historic, but history often hides in ordinary choices. In that roadside encounter, Elijah Brooks didn't know he was unlocking a truth buried beneath layers of corporate secrecy, institutional neglect, and generational oversight. All he knew was how to fix things. And maybe that's why it mattered. Because systems aren't just dismantled by legislation or broadcasted scandals. Sometimes they're undone by clarity, by kindness, by someone daring to do the right thing without needing an invitation. Years later, people would point to the Elias Center, the Open Futures Bill, the national overhaul of youth research ethics, and say that's where the change began. But Elijah always insisted it started earlier. It started with a single, unnoticed decision to stop and help, because someone needed it. That choice echoed forward. From rural towns to urban campuses, school districts began reevaluating their approach to gifted education. No longer focused solely on test scores or elite recommendations, programs began prioritizing curiosity, resilience, and community-based mentorship. Grants increased for interdisciplinary programs combining STEM with civic engagement. Federal pilot initiatives funneled new resources into underfunded regions, including mobile labs, teacher training fellowships, and trauma-informed support for students affected by systemic poverty. Some of the most transformative changes weren't flashy. They were foundational. Local school boards passed resolutions requiring transparency in public-private youth partnerships. Parents formed advisory committees to monitor how their children's data was being collected and used. States began offering tax incentives to tech firms that partnered with community makerspaces instead of elite prep academies. And all of it could be traced back, not to a corporation or a campaign, but to a kid who decided to help fix a car. For Elijah, the lesson was never about heroism. It was about momentum, about how one act could tip the balance, especially when it's repeated by others. At the Elias Center's 5th anniversary gala, he said, "We often wait for the big moment, the viral moment, the legislative moment, but don't underestimate the ripple made by a small act done with care. That's what got us here, not a revolution, just a choice." His words were broadcast live, but they resonated offline too. In a small town in Kansas, a middle school girl named Bria heard his speech and launched a peer tutoring program for students with learning disabilities. In a community center outside Baltimore, 2 teenagers repurposed abandoned vending machines into free book dispensers for neighborhoods without libraries. In New Orleans, a bus driver modified his route after school hours to take kids directly to a new STEM lab that had no public transit access. None of these made headlines, but they made something else. They made continuity. The kind of continuity that builds infrastructure, not of roads or systems, but of mindset. A mindset where brilliance isn't a surprise, where equity isn't a donation, where children aren't seen as future labor or liabilities, but as collaborators in shaping now. Elijah never asked to be a symbol, but the power of his story was that it could be symbolized. The emerald ring, the broken-down Bentley, The first blueprints scribbled on notebook paper. They became icons, simple enough to remember, powerful enough to repeat. And that's what storytelling does when it's done right. It teaches us to remember what matters, and what matters is rarely complicated. It's that children deserve protection before potential. That opportunity should be measured by access, not aptitude. That rebuilding isn't about nostalgia, it's about imagination. As Elijah prepared to leave the Elias Center for college, he recorded one final message for students arriving the following semester. It wasn't a speech, just a message on a loop, playing quietly in the entry hallway. Whatever room you walk into, remember, you belong there. And if the door was hard to open, leave it open for someone else. That's how we change everything. The camera that recorded the message didn't use dramatic lighting or music. Just natural light through the glass, the quiet hum of kids in the background, and Elijah's calm voice. In its simplicity, the video became one of the center's most shared uploads. The comment section filled with first names only. I'm Lena, age 12, starting robotics tomorrow, nervous but ready. Rico from Philly, I build speakers from scrap, just wanted to say thanks. My name is Tariq. I didn't know I was smart until I fixed a neighbor's phone. Now I'm here. Each one was its own small act, the kind that multiplies, and that's the power of stories grounded in truth. Not polished myths, but real choices made by real people who were underestimated, overlooked, or silenced. When those people speak, when their choices are seen, the world shifts. One of the final plaques installed at the Elias Center simply read, "You don't have to be chosen to begin. You just have to begin." The sun rose over the center that morning. Students arrived, backpacks bouncing, voices carrying in every direction. Someone dropped a wrench. Someone else laughed. A beginner's prototype flickered to life. And somewhere in the quiet of it all, the legacy continued. Not because of how loudly the past spoke, but because of how many had chosen to listen,